And welcome to another edition of What We Should Know, coming to you from Cambridge, Massachusetts. The perspective you have on your screen is from our studio camera looking across Massachusetts Avenue and the sidewalk over which individuals are walking and cars are passing. And in the distance, you can see Main Street. Cambridge, too, has a Main Street. Main Street intersects with Massachusetts Avenue. Here, directly catty-corner to our studios. And welcome to What We Should Know, or Peace Worker Radio. We'd like to thank very much guests of ours from the past and from the future. Paul Stephen Stone, who will be with us here, so is the plan, on Columbus Day, provided that's not a national holiday. And others who have helped structure this program. David Tabor, for instance, who is a veteran, visited us recently here and discussed questions of discrimination. Today's program is about discrimination. It's basically about the idea of alienation. Alienation is a concept in which classes are involved rather than individuals. The question of alienation is my belief. Individuals are alienated as well, but it's class alienation. In other words, individuals not only belong to a family, not only to a species, not only to a family, but also to a class. The question of class identity is, of course, interesting to individuals who have written and studied the idea of alienation. That will be our main topic for today, and we hope to give some examples of alienation from a class perspective, and also about why alienation is important to us in this time of preparation for the election of a new president here in the United States. The choice between the two candidates, the working class candidate was eliminated. Bernie Sanders is my choice, the choice of 46% of the electorate. But Bernie Sanders was eliminated due to manipulations of the Clinton campaign and particularly the Democratic National Party with Wasserman Schultz, who has since stepped down. There needs to be an entire reworking of the Democratic Party structure to eliminate the manipulation of the primary process and the caucus process, which was so badly handled and so devastatingly manipulated by the Clinton family, by the Clinton Foundation, by Wasserman Schultz, by the executives of the Democratic National Committee, etc., etc. It's a reality that class interests come to bear in moments like this. Clinton is most definitely, had she belonged to the middle class, has definitely migrated and mutated, is the term I would use, to be a staunch, ruthless member of the ruling elites. There can be no question about this. Bill Clinton, who nurtured her, his wife, in his governorship of Arkansas, and his presidency has manipulated funds, relationships, concepts to bring about these changes that we've seen in eliminating other classes from the struggle to achieve the position of being a nominee in the Democratic Party runoff against Donald Trump. There can be no question about the fact that Bernie Sanders would have completely annihilated Donald Trump, or at least put the argumentation on an entirely different basis. Trump would have been forced to look at argumentation, look at reasoning, rather than just spouting off the primitive way he does. And we'll be getting to that a little later in our program. Sanders would have been a much more viable candidate for the poor and working poor by making it clear whose interests Donald Trump supports. But with the structure of Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton both being from the ruling elites, there is no possibility of the interests of the working class in the United States to be met in this electoral cycle. And the reason for that is the resources that the ruling elites, that the elite class, that the ruling class can bring to bear in reference to the solution of a problem. That is the second part of the tenor of alienation that we would like to look at today. First of all, let's get a look at the idea of Jill Stein, whose party, the Greens, are the party which would represent the interests of the poor and working poor. She is the party which carries on the legacy of Bernie Sanders, the grassroots legacy of Bernie Sanders. And it is our position here at Peace Worker Radio, at What We Should Know, that the vote that the ruling elites took from Bernie Sanders should not be given to Hillary Clinton and should not be given to the libertarians. We'll be explaining this towards the end of the program, what function the libertarians have. Libertarians support the interests of the ruling elites by spouting off concepts of liberty, of freedom. There is no liberty and freedom where there is poverty and discrimination. And the discrimination in the United States is rampant. And the poverty and the withholding of resources from the poor and working poor is the method used by the elites to control the poor. So Jill Stein's platform is clear: our power to the people. And what basically this says is to enact an emergency Green New Deal to turn the tide on climate change. She is the only person, the Greens are the only party talking about climate change. To enact energy democracy based on public community and worker ownership of our energy system. It goes on. to end destructive energy extraction, to protect our public lands, to support strong enforcement of global climate treaty, to label GMOs, to support organic, etc., etc. And then the position jobs as a right is another position of the Green Party, Jill Stein's Green Party. Again, we are advocating that the vote not be given to the Libertarians, the Liberty Party, the party which supports the ruling elites, but rather to the party of the poor and working poor, the party of Bernie Sanders, the party in which the poor could have gotten a fair shake, but because of the Democratic Party's manipulation of the primaries and stealing of the primary process, we feel it's important at this time to give support to the party who inherits the interests brought forth by Bernie Sanders. Jobs as a right, the key support for labor. Then to end poverty is another Green Party platform. Guarantee economic human rights, including access to food, water, housing, and utilities. To establish the right to a living job wage. To reform public assistance. To be a true safety net. And free universal child care. This part is of very important basis. At the bottom of the screen, free universal child care. This is important for the working class mothers. The idea that Hillary Clinton will never put forward, her screeching that she is working in the interests of women, will show that as simply as screech and not as part of a solid intended political platform. Clinton works in the interests of the elites, as did her husband, as does the Democratic Party. Further interests of the Greens, the Green Party, Jill Stein. Give your vote to Jill Stein in the upcoming presidential election. Do not let the debates where Jill Stein has been prevented, Jill Stein's party has been prevented from taking part in the debates. The reason that the Green Party cannot debate is not that they haven't earned their right to debate. You could have the Libertarian Party and the Green Party be part of the debates. There would only be 4 candidates on stage, not 19, as was the beginning of the Republican primaries. 19 candidates who could possibly view all of that, but now we have 4 candidates left, truly viable candidates with positions that are interesting to the poor and working poor, but it is the reality of the class structure in the United States and of the ruling elites to eliminate any political basis of other parties who could challenge the content of the ruling elites by bringing up subject matters or by focusing the attention of the electorate on the similarities of the 2 candidates, not the differences between Clinton and Trump, but the massive similarities that they have. The Democratic and Republican parties are the basis for the crisis we have in the United States, because their politics are so amazingly similar. We need desperately in the United States a third party which will break down the discussions from an ideological to a practical basis. This is what is not happening in the debates, in the discussions between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, because there is no difference. They're whacking and yakking at one another. screeching, but without speaking to the issues that interest the American public. And the decision to prevent both other parties, both the Jill Stein party and the Libertarian Party. The Libertarian Party simply supports the ruling elites. The Green Party, whose platform we're showing now, supports the interests of the poor and working poor. For instance, the idea to eliminate the cancer of health insurance, which adds costs while reducing access to health care, to establish an improved Medicare for all, a single-payer health care system, which would save money and provide health care for every individual, to end overcharging for prescription, to eliminate health disparities, to allow full access to contraceptive and reproductive care, to expand women's access to the morning after contraception, etc., etc. Education as a right, another part of the platform that Bernie Sanders brought forward so successfully, that Jill Stein's party, the Greens, were asking everyone who supported Bernie Sanders to give your vote not to Hillary Clinton. Don't worry about the fact that the other party, the Republican Party, the party that Donald Trump has usurped, will win the election. If he wins the election, it does not have to do with popular vote, because it's not the popular vote that determines who's president of the United States. It is the Electoral College who determines who's president of the United States. And this is a question of the elites, another security system used by the elites to prevent that popular vote is the determining factor in whose name the President of the United States is determined. Education as a right is a position which the Green Party has brought forward. And to replace the Common Core with curriculum developed by educators, not corporations. Green Party's platform, education as a right. Look on the web. Look on the internet. Google Jill Stein and Ojama Baraka for the Green Party. The Green Party has a black as vice president candidate. We've had Barack Obama as a president of the United States who has done very little to improve the position of blacks. He has not closed Guantanamo Bay, a primary focus of his candidacy. He has not ended the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. He has not made an economy or an educational system accessible to the millions. He has not put a healthcare system in place, although his Obamacare has withstood the challenge of the Supreme Court. He still has not put a system in place which prevents the continual increase of costs to the poor and working poor. Recently, the HMOs increased by 25%, approximately 25%, the cost of medications and care, after the Supreme Court had determined that the primary positions of the Obama healthcare program is constitutionally legal. The position is still a crisis for the poor and working poor, and there are still 40 million Americans who cannot afford health care under the Obama program. Jill Stein and the Green Party would change that and change the basis of education, as they would labor for another Bernie Sanders program, the $15 an hour federal minimum wage, a guarantee of a living wage for all. Support development of worker and community cooperatives for small businesses. Make Wall Street and big corporations pay for their usurping of the economy. The idea is to end the economy of the working elites, of Hillary Clinton, of Bill Clinton, of Donald Trump, all of whom represent the interests of the ruling elites. This is clear that Clintons and Trump, Giuliani, Bloomberg, Elon Musk, all of these individuals work in the interests of the ruling elites to present and continue to improve their position at the expense of the poor and working poor, to create an economy which works in the interest of the elites. We've already known that through the position that Bernie Sanders has taken, that the elites control the economy. They continue to control the economy by bringing forth their position in manipulating financial, social, political, educational, health resources, so that it is the elites that profit from the structure. We see, as far as the tax returns are concerned, that the tax system that enables Donald Trump to take advantage of nearly $1 billion in losses, ostensibly from his 1990-something tax return that continues into the present. Trump gets to write off $1 billion and doesn't pay his bills, and he says that shows that he's smart. And you have Giuliani, the mayor of ex-mayor of the city of New York, saying it proves that he's a genius because he doesn't pay his bills, because he manipulates the economy, because he says he's smart. Giuliani says he's a genius. Why is that not in the interests of the class that Giuliani, that Bloomberg, that Clinton, that Trump all have inherited and all show from week to week whose interests they support and how they support one another? That's the reason we're calling upon those who voted for Bernie Sanders in the primaries to give your vote to Jill Stein, because her party platform is for a just economy, because her party platform is for freedom and equality, to protect LGBT rights, to expand women's rights, to defend indigenous rights, to support immigrants' rights, to halt deportations. Why would Mexican Americans, why would those facing deportation vote for any other party but Jill Stein? Why would they possibly come up with any other idea? Why the Democratic Party when Jill Stein is obviously has a party platform in their interest? Criminal justice reform. Why would an individual whose relatives are incarcerated in a federal system, or the 10 millions of Americans who have a felony record, why would anyone who has a felony record vote for a party candidate or for a party, the Republicans or Democratic parties, who do not have any type of rehabilitation in place for felons, who do not want to reform the criminal justice system and term that defies any explanation whatsoever. Criminal justice? There is no criminal justice. There is no rehabilitation system in the United States which is effective. The return rate to prison is enormous. It's around 60 to 70% for felons. How could this be a reform system? The crisis continues, but we're calling upon to enforce the Bill of Rights by protecting the right to free speech and protest, to secure from unwarranted search and seizure, to end discrimination against former offenders who have paid for their crimes. In other words, a criminal justice reform, to abolish the death penalty, to end a persecution of the government, corporative, and media whistleblowers, peace and human rights. This is a party platform which works for everyone, at least for the middle class, at least for the poor and working poor, for those who have a criminal record, for those who are felons, for those who are immigrants, for those who are poor, for those who are disadvantaged, for those who are jobless, for those who are without housing, for those who are veterans. The list goes on and on. The reality here at Peace Worker Radio, at What We Should Know, is clear. Give your vote in the presidential election, not to a Democrat, not to a Republican, and not to a party that supports the Democratic and Republican parties. Do not give your vote to the Libertarians, because they support directly through the idea of liberty, the idea of freedom, the idea of liberty and freedom are just terms which do not reflect the reality of the poor and working poor in the United States. The reality of the poor and working poor in the United States is clear. The reality is that if you have no health care, if you can't afford child care, if you have a criminal record, if you do not belong to the class that earns at least $125,000, that's the Clinton line drawn for free tuition. That is upper middle class. If you do not belong to that income category, then you cannot even vote for Clinton, because you wouldn't reap the benefits of educational reform by Clinton, were she to be elected president. By Donald Trump, there will be no educational reform. If you're poor or working poor, there is no reason whatsoever to vote Donald Trump. Don't listen to these screeching sports crazed white men of my age, because they don't have the first idea about political ideas, and they don't have the first idea about gambling. Here's the reality of the weekend. White men who follow sports are obsessed this time of year with the fact that the playoffs are there, and not only the baseball playoffs, but also football season. Many of you know that in football season there's a spread. In other words, two teams play according to their power structure or ability or likelihood to win the game. There's a spread, a point spread, and this point spread is the basis for arguments, bettings, fantasy sports games. White men, obsessed. So the point spread for the local team was 6. I don't have to say who the local team was. Everybody knows who the local team was. The point spread was 6. The owner of the team, of the local team, is a billionaire. Like the owner of most football teams, very wealthy men. The point spread was 6, but the local team did not meet the point spread, lost by several times the point spread, and didn't win the game, but lost the game. It would not take a mathematical genius to figure out how much money changed hands due to that not meeting the point spread. Of course, everyone is disappointed that the local team lost, but the question is, who won? With certainty, those who had something to win and had the money to win and had the influence to control the outcome had a lot to win. That's an example. But there are other examples, of course, and we would like to get a look at what we're talking about. We're talking about alienation. Many of you know about the game Alienation. Alienation release date is out now. It's an action form. So what you see on your screen in this Alienation, perhaps it will become clear, and we'd like to thank the game producers of Alienation. Basically, what you see are people, warriors, jumping out of an airplane. They're jumping out of an airplane and fleeing towards Earth, where they will go into battle and kill and maraud. And that is basically, those could be the alienators there. The concept is not, however, a battle concept as much as it is a concept of social structure, specifically originated to explain a psychological phenomena. So this picture emotionally shows domination. These individuals, from the perspective there, show that they are fierce and ready to dominate. They're flying through space to certain death when they land on that surface, if they don't have a way to either slow their fall. In any case, those are the warriors, those are the heroes. The game is Alienation. You can buy it and you can play. Let's look at what alienation is under Wikipedia. Alienation, there's alienation under property law, has the idea, the legal transfer of title of ownership to another party. That's the alienation under a legal term, or the alienation effect. And audiences, an audience, you are the audience, so that's what we're talking about, an audience. And we thank Wikipedia for this ability. An audience's inability to identify with a character in a performance as an intended consequence of the actor's interpretation of the script. Well, you're the audience, so if you're not identifying with what I'm saying, I've failed my effort here. But under Marx's theory, Karl Marx, the theory of alienation, the separation of things that naturally belong together, or antagonism between those who are properly in harmony, which looks at parental alienation as a psychological concept. Just below that, it says, psychological alienation of a child from a parent, especially after divorce, such that the child acts with hostility towards the parent. We all know that that is the case. We know basically that alienation takes place between parents, leading to divorce, and then the alienation of the children due to the lack of harmony between parents. Children do not know how to relate then to their parents or to which parent because of this fear of displeasing the other parent, and them being, the children being dependent upon the support, the love, the care of both parents. A psychological concept, the one of alienation that we're speaking about here. So parental alienation, psychological alienation of a child from a parent, especially after divorce. And above that, Marx's theory of alienation, the separation of things that naturally belong together. The separation of things that naturally belong together. Important, I believe, here in reference to the concept of alienation, the separation of things that belong together, that naturally belong together, of course relates then to the idea of work. We're not talking about warriors leaping out of planes. We're not speaking about the psychological alienation of children in divorce. We're speaking about now the application of work and the aspect of alienation. So if we can look at that for a moment, how is the worker alienated, separated? It just means separated, I believe. How is the worker separated from what he's working on? That's the question. So how does this alienation, this separation of things that belong together, worker and his product, worker and what he's working at, the worker and what he does, the worker and his colleagues, the worker and his support system, the worker and his unions, the worker and his environment, the worker and his family, the worker and his wages, the worker and his working conditions. These are things that belong together. So how is it that these things become separated, become alienated from one another. Well, that's basically what the concept of alienation is about. It's a psychological concept, and it came about basically through the change in production. The change in production began early in the Renaissance, so 1300s, 1400s, in which a class developed out of the feudal system, separating the feudal system from its unified interests between the church and the state, separating and developing further interests, further classes from this opportunity, the opportunity that the artisan class developed. We think of those who came up with certain architectural changes, fortification systems, or the windmill, or the certain power generative possibilities, or scientific changes, which began taking place at about the Renaissance. The first ideas, Enlightenment, of course, was 18th century, but between the 13th and the 18th century, a number of developments took place which led to the establishment of the capitalistic production system. We hear communism, socialism, capitalism. There's only one system that's good. That's the system of capitalism because of its freedom. The Libertarian Party says because of the freedom that it gives everyone. The capitalistic production system does not give the workers much. That's certainly the case because of the development over the last 60 years, which has been shown clearly that the elites are the only class profiting from the immense growth on productivity. If the growth on productivity was given evenly to the working class, to the middle class, and to the elites, then we would not have the disparity that we have now, economic disparity, because each of the classes would have profited from the productivity, the immense productivity gains, but because only the elites, only the ruling elites, only the Clintons of the world, the Trumps of the world, the Bloombergs of the world, the Elon Musks of the world, the Giulianis of the world have profited from the productivity gains. We have this disparity. So the disparity has been brought about by the capitalist production system and by the fact that this productivity gain has not been distributed because the unions have not been strong enough basically to guarantee this. The blacks have been passive and killed in large numbers. We remember the Attica riots in New York, Rockefeller's crushing of the Attica riots, which could have been very influential in a criminal justice reform, but were quelched, but were shown to be corrupted by the press, as the press has done in numerous other occasions. We'll speak about the concept of free press at another meeting. To focus again on the reality of the alienation as far as the economics are concerned is that the workers and the working class, the working poor, the lower middle class have been alienated from the increase in wages and benefits and standard of living which could have taken place had the distribution of productivity gains been equally distributed to all classes. But that hasn't been the case because the Republican and Democratic parties have had presidents, the Clintons, then the Bushes, then the Obamas, and now the Clintons again. So that is part of the problem. We want to speak now basically about how alienation takes place in political crisis. We saw here in the alienation game the reality of the separation from that which belongs together and the domination you see in this game. We thank the producers of Alienation, Sony. We thank vividly Sony, this corporate giant, for giving us the opportunity to use this on today's program, showing the alienation idea of the separation of things that belong together, the going into battle, you can see figures as these individuals fly into battle. Many of our viewers may have used this alienation game. So the idea in reference to warfare and the separation of the interests of a people from their surroundings is a typical example of alienation on a massive scale through the use of warfare. We'll look at the Cuban Missile Crisis as a particular example of this, and we thank Fact Tank for the opportunity to look at this particular structure. The surge in Cuban immigration to U.S. countries continues into 2016. The surge in Cuban immigration, Cubans have been surging to the United States not only in the 1960s, in which about 1.5 million Cubans migrated, but also in the 1980s, in which 125,000 Cubans migrated. Here you can see the number of Cubans entering the U.S. on the rise. It looks like the top line here is 50,000. The line on the far left is 10,000. So where in 2005 it was 10,000, now it's 50,000. So what are we talking about, this immigration of Cubans? Hungarians share Europe's embrace of democratic principles, but are less tolerant of refugees, minorities. We can look at that. Let's look at, because the refugees, Hungarians share Europe's embrace of democratic principles. because that's basically, also, this is from Fact Tank. It's in reference to a vote which took place on the weekend showing that the Hungarians are less tolerant of immigrants. The reason for this, Hungarians being less tolerant, and the reasons for their being that way, and referring to refugees as poison, has to do with the fact that Hungarians have a long history of having very reactionary governments. If you have a long history of having a reactionary governmental process, and if your standard of living is low, if you have a poor healthcare system, a poor educational system, then, and a volatile class structure, in other words, if there are not a large number of medium income individuals, a middle class, if that is not available, the country with a few number of elites, but very wealthy elites, and a large number of poor and working poor, many of whom are perhaps don't have the advantages of a good education. This is how the United States is developing. The rise of people like Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, the manipulation of the primary structure to prevent Bernie Sanders, whose class interests are with the poor and working poor, and whose position is the same as that of Jill Stein. Jill Stein has taken over Bernie Sanders' position and called for to end poverty, healthcare as a right, jobs as a right, and a key support for labor. Jill Stein's position is power to the people, and we are calling upon all of the viewers to elect, to give their vote in the presidential election to Jill Stein party, because they are the followers, have inherited what the Democratic Party has prevented from taking place, namely a platform in which Bernie Sanders call for the distribution of the productivity gains not alone to the elites, but to be distributed among the poor and working poor. That would have been a health care for all, free education for all in public universities and colleges, a minimum wage, at least $15, a healthcare system which allows every individual to receive health care, a universal single-payer healthcare system like Medicare, Medicaid. These are the demands of Jill Stein's party. There is no reason, no effective reason for the middle class, the lower middle class, the poor, blacks, immigrants, those living under the restrictions of a corrupt criminal justice system. There is no reason for any of those members of that class, I include myself, that as a poor, old, white guy, there is no interest whatsoever to voting either for the Libertarian, certainly not for Donald Trump, certainly not for the Democratic Party, but for Jill Stein. She has the party and has the interests of the poor and working poor at heart. So to close off our position today and to recoup what we've said, we're calling upon viewers to vote for Jill Stein because of her platform, because of the party, and the reason we're calling upon that is because Black lives do matter. The continued killing of blacks by police officers is an untenable situation in the United States. It shows a blatant disrespect for poor and working poor along racial lines. It is a system which will turn on every American because the police are not checked. There is no check and balance system in local governments or in state, and certainly not in the federal government, because none of those structures have been able to implement a position in which black lives are protected. We see also that the immigration problem, the Hungarian referendum recently shows this, but also Cuban-American position, the immigration, massive immigration from Cuba to the United States. An example of this is the 1.5 million immigrants in the 1960s